The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are only those of the speaker and do not represent the views and opinions of any other than those who said them. Welcome to episode 8 of 1H. 1H is a platform intended to help people share their thoughts and ideas regarding decentralized education, leadership, technology, and analysis. 1H is hosted on the Gridcoin Discord server every Thursday, 8 p.m. Eastern, 1 a.m. UTC. Everyone is welcome to join the conversation through the Discord chat. If you would like to talk about a subject on 1H, reach out to Jay Ringo on the Gridcoin Discord server and the Gridcoin Slack for the subject you wish to discuss and the participants who intend to speak. There are 3 rules when broadcasting on 1H. You can talk about a project, but only if you're using it as an example to illustrate the idea behind the project. The focus of any subject should somehow be related to decentralized education, leadership, technology, or analysis, and swearing and vulgarity is not permitted. So the topic today is open access, which is one of my favorite topics. It's something I've been involved in one way or another for a number of years. And first off, I just want to dedicate this episode to Aaron Swartz, who was a huge proponent of the open access movement, at least here in the US, but more or less globally. His work and what he stood for and the things he said really led me to get involved in open access, open source, and opened roads to me that I did not think or did not even know existed before. Just a little quick as a tidbit about who he was. These are the things that Aaron Swartz was involved in making: RSS, Markdown, Creative Commons, Reddit, Demand Progress, Tor2Web, Open Library, and he was a huge proponent in stopping the Stop Online Piracy Act, known as SOPA, here in the US. The way he worked to stop SOPA was absolutely amazing. It was a completely decentralized leadership role where he empowered a lot of other activists to get involved and flip the vote from basically the majority of Congress in the US supporting SOPA to within a couple weeks, the majority rejecting SOPA. And SOPA was a pretty bad bill when it comes to internet freedom. If he were still around today, unfortunately he's not, but if he was, we would most likely be living in a fairly different world, particularly here in the US. He was involved in politics and internet, and he was very good at playing systems to the advantage of freedom. So, open access. Open access is, it's been around since about it's been around for decades, but the way we see it today, the way we know it today, it's been around since about the 90s and early 2000s when the internet really started to take off. It's dealing with primarily peer-to-peer reviewed articles released from universities and university researchers and university students. And it deals, a lot of what I'll be talking about comes from Dr. John Walensky. He is a huge advocate for open access. He goes around, he gives talks. He has written a lot about education and learning and the open access world. So from his view, open access has to do with on a philosophical level, the concept of knowledge and what is knowledge. And a quote from him is, "Knowledge can only claim to be knowledge insofar as is shared and made public." So that basically means that anything you know is not knowledge unless you share it, which is a main tenet of open access, which is anyone has access to the data or knowledge learned from someone else, particularly at a university. Open access is also part of open source. You can see how they are connected through the way that open access advocates for crediting the researcher over monetary gain. It's more an idea about a conversation and using what we've learned or what the researcher has learned to continue that conversation. Not so much just, it's the same idea as using source code to continue the conversation about what you want to do with that code, just with academic research, scientific research. So when it comes to OA, because of people like Aaron Swartz and many others, OA is pretty prevalent in the world. Most university professors know about it. Most researchers know about it. It's not like OER, which we discussed a couple episodes ago, where it was said that it's only just starting to break the recognition barrier, where professors, for the most part, don't even know what open educational resources are. With open access, they know what it is. So when it comes down to a practical sense of why we want open access, the anecdote, the story that's told a lot is how doctors use research and how doctors having access to academic research helps save lives on a very practical level. So the idea is basically this. Doctors work by when a patient comes to them, the patient's sick. Most often than not, the doctor doesn't know what the patient is sick with. They run tests. Maybe they're lucky and they know exactly what the test results mean, but at the same time, they need to figure out the best treatment for that disease for that patient. So what a doctor does is research. They see what other doctors and other researchers have done with this disease or with this set of test results that maybe they don't even know what the disease is, and they see what the results of these actions from these researchers or other doctors are. So in the past, with the proprietary model, instead of proprietary models, the opposite of open access, in the past, that was hindered. That practice was hindered because a doctor would have to pay to get access to that research. So long story short, the doctor can't save a life because they can't get the best knowledge about what's going on with their patient. So when you take that paywall away, when you say anyone can look at this research, all of a sudden you have you're saving lives. And that's one of the most practical ways you can look at it. On a more philosophical level, it creates this thing called continuity of education, where we can use the same analogy here, the same anecdote, where a patient goes into the doctor's office and this patient has a spouse, and the spouse goes home and also does this research. Now, if the spouse does not have access to academic journals, they're going to either not learn anything, or they're going to have access to very specific information, very specific knowledge shared by people trying to make money. It's controlled education. So when they have access to all the information, they will likely learn more, even if they're just doing it because they love this person. They're not going to be the person that saves the life. The doctor is most likely going to be the person that saves the life, but they will end up learning stuff. And by learning things, it becomes part of the larger conversation of society. And that goes beyond just the doctor's story. Everything, when you have access to information and knowledge and data and everything that's learned at the university, it just becomes part of the larger story of the larger conversation that society is having. A good example of how this works is Wikipedia and the internet in general. Before the internet and sources like Wikipedia or Google, you would, for example, be having a conversation with your friend. I would say one thing, my friend would say another thing, and we would be disagreeing, and we would just have to stop the conversation because neither of us would know. Now, with this access to this information, we can say, well, you think one thing, I think the other thing, let's look it up, let's figure out what the truth is. And so long as we have access to what the best truth we know actually is, then we learn through that process. If there's a paywall, if every time we had a disagreement with a friend, we had to pay $10 to figure out which one of us is right, we would probably not learn as much as we do today. So those are loose, basic level practical scenarios of open access and why it's an important part of a technological society and a scientific society and a society that prioritizes education over profit.
So I don't know if you want to throw this in before or after, but can I get a distinction between open source and open access? How are those two different, or are they effectively just delineations of the same thing?
By my understanding, they're the same principle in different in different fields. So open source comes out of coding. The term open source comes out of coding, but it's the same idea as open access. And open access comes out of academic research and learning.
So I can give you an example. If you're making a mathematical model to analyze, let's say, how you want to bend the or change the direction of a solar panel over time to reflect as much reflect as much, to absorb as much sunlight as possible, so that you create as much energy as possible. You create the mathematical model, you run the simulations, and blah, 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 blah. So open access would be, okay, you publish your results in a journal, but that, whatever those results are openly available on the internet. They're not behind a paywall. You can access them on archive or some other database. Open source would be taking the actual model itself, with the code, and leaving it open to anybody who wants to use it, change it, criticize it, look at it, etc.
That's a pretty good distinction. Okay, so the where are we now in the world of open access? As I said, this has been a fight that's been going on for decades, and there have been brilliant people who have been working on this all their lives. Aaron Swartz, someone who I look up to personally. Dr. John Walensky is also someone who's been working on this movement for a long time. And there are other scientists. Most scientists truly support open access if they can still make a living, and we'll get to that in a minute. But for example, if you want to find another resource, you can look up PLOS, the Public Library of Open Science, and there are a bunch of other scientific journals that have really paved the way to open access models when it comes to publishing. As evidence of this advancements we've made in open access, you can look at what happened in 2008 in the US. So there's this institution called the National Institution of Health, the NIH. They are one of the largest grant providers in the world. The tens of billions of dollars goes out to research from NIH. In 2008, they were given a mandate that says to tell their researchers, the people that they fund with the grant money, that if these researchers want to continue getting grant money, they have to make their results, their data, their research open access when they publish it. And that was a fairly large step. That said, the federal government is going to back, at least in the United States, is going to back open access and the concept of it. And that really started to make it so you could say that open access has started to win, but we'll see how not really in a second. So at this point, there are about 23 to 25% of peer-reviewed literature goes into open access through either open access journals or something called self-archiving. But when you look at alternative means, you can get up to 50% of research being open access, and alternative means are essentially pirating. It's the use of the digital world. There's, for example, there's a site called Sci-Hub, which just lets researchers put their articles up, and people can go there and download them for free. They're very popular. They get massive volumes of traffic. They're basically using something. Besides just researchers putting up, there are people like Aaron Swartz who advocate for something called guerrilla open access, where they go and take documents that are behind paywalls, and largely documents that are meant to be open access already, like legal documents, and then put them on the open internet. So taking stuff from the legacy system and putting it in the digital system. So when you consider that we are moving into this digital world, we're probably going to see a lot more of that, and we'll be getting up closer to 60 or 70% of open access research. Particularly with the blockchain, there are a bunch of communities, Gridcoin included, who are looking at scientific research and published articles and thinking about how we can bring it into the blockchain and make it so people can access research directly from the blockchain. And when you do that, when you bring something into the blockchain like that, you add a level of accreditation to the researcher, to the person who puts it up, that can't be taken away, which is particularly important right now, because in the world we live on right now, while there are maybe 50% or up to 50% of research articles being distributed through open access means, they still have to get published. And 5 major publishing companies own all the open access documents. So yes, they're accessible to everyone, but they're also owned by just 5 companies. And we see that in many different industries in the world. But this is kind of a problem, particularly when it comes to intellectual property, which we'll be getting into shortly. So for an example of that, there's one of the corporations called Elsevier, and what they do. So the articles are open access, but they reserve the rights to the intellectual property of that research. And the way they do it is so that they can profit the most. So their article, their contract says that they own the intellectual property of the article for 70 years past the death of the youngest publisher of the article. So they get to do whatever they want with it for 70 years after the death of the youngest publisher. And then at the same time, they go out to researchers and they say, these researchers, they've spent their whole life in science, they're 40, 50, 60, and they say to them, hey, get your PhD students involved with this research. That gives them a 20-year-old on the research docket. So they now own the research for the life of that 20-year-old plus 70 years. It blows my mind sometimes the way that these companies can work around stuff. So because they put the research out through open access, that destroys the previous model, which was proprietary, which is you pay for access to the article, which raises a question that Technics brought up in the chat a little bit ago, which is, how is this research funded? So in the proprietary model, people pay to get access to the results of the research, and that is how the research is funded, plus grants. But with the new open access model, with the IP owned by companies, they make models where they make money by charging fees to publish the article, to go through the publishing process, because it does take money to, they're not funding the research, but it takes money to, line everything up right and make it look pretty and put it out there. But they charge large fees. And what they end up doing is taking a lot of the grant money from researchers and making it go to publishing. So there are three ways to look at why open access generally makes sense. Why it makes sense that the research of peer-reviewed academics, of the knowledge learned at universities, should be accessible to everyone. The practical story I already told about, the doctor saving lives every day. They use it. They will use it. The other ones are more, these three are a little more philosophical. The first one is the way it's funded, through public grants. So the idea of a public grant is that me, you, everybody listening, everyone here in this channel, we pay taxes to the government. The government represents our will, and the government then gives this money to organizations like NIH to then give that money to researchers through a grant system. So ultimately, me and you, we're paying for the research done at a university. So technically, we should own that research in the world we live today. But we don't. What happens a lot is there are other companies that come in and make contracts, non-disclosure, that where they own the research. But if we pay for it, it should be ours. We should be able to access it just on a basic capitalistic scale. We paid for it. It's ours. Now, that's the first way. The second way is this idea of a social contract, which is, it brings up the question of what is a university. A university is this place of higher learning that goes back close to 1,000 years. Universities are some universities are some of the oldest institutions in our society right now, on par with churches and religious orders. So a university began as this social grant where government would give the university land in return for their knowledge. And that's basically just the contract. We give you grant money, we give you land, you give us the knowledge that you discover, because it's for the greater societal good. We're all working together. We're giving you the resources, you're giving us what you learn. You can't copyright what you learn for profit. So those are the first 2 points. The third point is the idea of intellectual property. Who owns the research, the knowledge learned by this group of people or person who worked very hard to learn the thing? Generally, it is the idea that if you go back to John Locke, is the idea of labor. If you work the land, you are the owner of the property. And we can talk about what that did to specific nations at specific times in terms of kicking people off the land. But when it comes to knowledge, if you do the research, you own the research. That is your knowledge. And what happens for the most part, you can follow this back through I'm summarizing a lot of this. You can follow it back to the publishing industry for a long time. But if the researcher owns the research, they generally like the idea of putting it out there and getting credit for it, because most researchers understand that the reason they were able to learn what they learned is because they learned something from someone else. And it brings back the idea of continuity of education, where we're building things together and changing the way we as a society talk about things or exposed to specific things. We're trying to make it so that we can build on the work of one another. And really all we want is the credit for the work that we put in. The money is there and people should get paid for it, but not at the level that exists right now where these 5 major publishers own the property, own the intellectual property of the researchers. So there's that dichotomy there of the researcher does the work, and then the work they do is no longer owned by them. It's given away to another company who can do whatever they want with it. And for now, they're making it open access, and they're doing things that we are telling them to do, but it's still on a principle level. It's taking away the intellectual property that is ingrained in how we work as a society on the theoretical level of capitalism. There, you do the labor, you own the property. So one of the two has to change. That's basically a very quick overview of what open access is, where it came from. Some people you can Google: Aaron Swartz, Dr. John Lewinsky, an organization, Public Library of Open Science, and some other general stats about open access in general. So at this point, I'll just open it up if anyone has any responses or any questions.
So I think one of the main things to get around in open access really comes down to funding. And I know you just talked a lot about it. But just to kind of share my point of view, and so my roommate actually worked for a pharmaceutical company doing like testing, like creating the data points for these kinds of papers and such, doing activities at a major pharmaceutical organization. And it's interesting. He would kind of very generically describe what he was doing, because obviously you can't really get into the details. But he would do some overarching comments and tell me about some of the highlights, and a couple of the things that he mentioned was really like, oh, the other day I got to watch someone use this crazy radioactive isotope for some of the tests we were running, right? And he's like, yeah, that has to be governmentally monitored, and it was crazy. And it's like, the thing was several thousands of dollars worth for each test they wanted to run. And so like some of these tests that some of the larger organizations are trying to do, right, are extremely expensive, right? With some, like, I mean, I did economics in college, and I always remember reading the economic papers and realizing that, I mean, the cost for some research areas, like such as economics, aren't as expensive because you're more or less gathering information, like through polling and studies and such. With the scientific research, you're literally having to get resources, sometimes radioactive, sometimes very scarce. And it makes sense why you would want to try and and keep that to yourself, right? You spent probably $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 just to figure out that one test, that one thing, right? And then suddenly you're saying, okay, now after spending all that thousands upon thousands of dollars, several hundreds of thousands of dollars when you factor in wages and maybe mess ups and tests that didn't result in actually useful information, then you're saying you have to, that becomes open source, right? And so while I do agree on some level that there should be a number of open access documentation, a lot of it has a huge paywall to even be done. And so I guess the question is, how do you promote businesses and researchers from wanting to offer the ones that are too expensive for anyone other than a private organization to do?
We got two responses to that. The first one, just right off the bat. So you're right. There are specific science endeavors that are very, very expensive and highly and pretty dangerous too. And the way that Dr. Linsky puts it is that the last 20% of open access of these academic journals are going to be the hardest to get to be open access for, I think, just that reason, is because of what you just said. There's some stuff that people shouldn't maybe have unfettered access to, or there needs to be a way to make money off of it because it was so absolutely expensive. At the same time, we're still only at 50%. So there's still so much more to bring into the open access realm besides this last 20% that's going to be fairly difficult. And then the other response to it is more philosophical, and it was actually brought to the Supreme Court. There was a pharmaceutical company that discovered a gene that I think had to do with breast cancer, and they tried to patent the gene. And I forget who sued them, but they got sued, and they said you can't patent a gene that does not. No, the Supreme Court agreed with that. They said you can't patent a gene, and I have not actually read the reasoning from the Supreme Court, but what I would like to believe is that it's because this is just knowledge that exists. You discover something. It's not something you can own. It's just something that's there. And there are other ways to make money off of it. You can open access your research, but you don't need to open source your process for taking that research and turning it into a product, a workable product. It would be awesome if people did and then stood beside their product instead of in front of it, but it's understandable if something costs several tens of millions of dollars of high priority funding that they would want to make it a little profitable for them and at least cover their costs and then make a little bit of profit. But again, not at the level that a lot of pharmaceutical companies do right now. So there's this argument that it's like, yes, you're right, but at the same time, how right are you? How far do you want to take it? Like, do you want these companies to be able to jack up the price of an EpiPen just because they've monopolized it? Or like who's the pharma bro here in the U.S., Martin Shkreli or something like that, who bought the rights to research and then jacked up the price because he was the only one who could make it. Like, yeah, you can make profit, but you can't do that. That's a little wrong. So it's drawing that line somewhere and putting it in paper and into a protocol, which is something you can sort of maybe do in a blockchain.
So, and I obviously I don't want to get into any kind of political or moral talk, but actually, have you actually listened to? There's a couple actual interesting videos. So Shkreli has one of the world's most punchable faces, hands down. Not going to argue that. But have you actually watched any of the videos where he like explains his reasoning behind raising the prices?
With a very biased perspective, so I probably wasn't open to what he was saying. If you want to summarize it without
so really to summarize, and again, like definitely not saying he's a nice person, but he makes a very valid point for why he raised the price of it. So when you do the scope out, right? In the sales world, there's a term used a lot, which is called backing into the price, right? Which is effectively saying in order to make money on this, we need X, and you have to figure out how much whatever you're going to do is costing, and you have to slowly back the number up and figure out, okay, what are we getting to, right? You use the numbers and you try to work with it to get to what you need to get to. And effectively, what he did was he was like, okay, this is the kind of money we're going to need to do research for the next version of the drug. And the drug that he bought, and this kind of works into my point regarding funding and such. The drug that he bought was extremely old, right? It was actually, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think the drug was last produced, like was last updated in like the 50s or 60s. And effectively, it's a very poor drug for what it does. It really doesn't do much, but it's considered one of those orphan drugs that solves a weird disease that doesn't happen too often. And since it doesn't happen too often, there's not an outcry to make it better. And it only really sometimes works, and when it does work, it's pretty terrible, the side effects. And so he bought it and jacked the price up because, one, most of the drugs are given away for free with certain programs. They actually have a subset of the number of drugs that they have to just give away. And on top of that, with the average insurance that people had, while it was some crazy, stupid number, most people were only paying something like $10 to $40 rather than that $600. And only an extremely, extremely small percentage of people were paying that max amount, and those were people that were likely uninsured. And most of that money, after you take away all the actual costs, was actually being used to redirect towards developing a new version of the drug, a better version of the drug, since this one hadn't been updated. Again, still very punchable face, but he didn't do it just to be a jerk. There were some reasons, and the reasons at least he gave, at least the ones he said, right? The ones he at least said he did. Not sure if he actually did it for those reasons. But the ones that he said he did it for were for like research money, and if nothing else, to kind of get the community a little riled up to actually do something and try and work it.
So in the system that he's operating in, that makes sense. But when you build that modus operandi into the system, people are able to do that with everything, like the EpiPen. And the EpiPen costs very little to make, but because it's in high demand, people play around with it and play around with the price. And at the same time, there are, yes, a lot of people get it for free through insurance and through government programs. And because they get it for free through insurance and government programs, they don't pay attention to what's happening to the price. And they end up paying more for it through insurance and other cuts to social programs, because there's a law that says the school must buy the EpiPen. But because the school must buy it, it doesn't matter what it costs. I'm not going to, as long as my kid has access to an EpiPen at school, I don't care what it costs. So the company who buys the EpiPen, this has been happening recently, just starts raising the price. And they do it slowly over time. And then there are moments when someone like Skrelly comes along, buys the company, and jacks it up really quick, and then people notice. But without Skrelly, it still happens on a low scale, and nothing is for free. They still pay for it, just not directly. And their companies are able to get away with this because the funding structure is so convoluted, and the legal structure behind it. So when you open access stuff, when you rely on open access, it says the majority of research should be done at research institutions through this social contract. Research shouldn't be owned by these private corporations. Sure, there's a place for them in specific scenarios, but you shouldn't be able to, as a private corporation, go to a university and make the professors sign NDAs regarding their research, and then take that research and make something highly profitable from it without even disclosing how much it actually costs to make, and all the other costs involved in doing the research.
If I could maybe give a clear example of government funding and open access. So the pharmaceutical stuff's a bit complicated because of who's paying for what research. There's actually quite a lot of research that is funded by the government that ends up being used by pharmaceutical companies, but that's a rabbit hole, because then you have to start looking at real numbers. So the modern computer was built. The components of the modern computer were almost entirely designed with government funds. I think the only exception to that is the transistor, which was developed by AT&T, which had a monopoly at the time. And besides for that, all the other components of the modern day computer were effectively built with government funding, a lot of it with DARPA. So when you look at tech companies today, you could look at Apple, or you can look at Microsoft, or any tech company. The only reason they exist is because computers exist. But these companies pay ridiculously low taxes. And in fact, they're quite famous for avoiding taxes in this country, despite the fact that the entire reason they exist is because of massive risk by the public. And so the risks were private, but the risks were public, but the profits were private. And if we were living in a world where research that was funded by the public actually benefited the public directly instead of being privatized, these companies would be paying much higher taxes, because they really wouldn't even exist right now if it wasn't for publicly funded research.
So I think especially in this space, because I kind of believe that there are a lot of researchers, very, very, very good researchers who kind of follow the money, right? And I think a kind of paid, like, as much as I want to believe that a lot of people would do stuff like this if it was open access, which there totally would be a lot of research for open access, I think there is some research that would really only exist through a funding model. So I think one of the ways that I like the most, because I think I've mentioned this in a number of other chats we've had, and that's kind of, I always believe that the answer always belongs, or the answer really always exists in somewhere of the blurred center, and it's kind of the reason in medicine, what I like the most is actually like a kind of pharmaceutical model, where when you make a new drug, you have X number of years before like the generics can come out. I'm not exactly sure on the specifics around that, but I think you have like 2 or 3 years before companies are allowed to make mocks of effectively the same thing. Like Tylenol and the knockoffs of Tylenol and so on. And so if I like to think that the same thing should exist for almost the research papers, where if you found something really, really cool, like you put a lot of money into this research and you found it, that's awesome, good for you. The next thing would be to say that, okay, you have from the signing date of when you're done, or they might figure out some loophole to push that away. So, but like from some date where you realize some value of that paper, you have 3-4 years before it is forced into open access. Like, your benefit to your business is that you have 3 or 4 years ahead of everyone else with that information to do as you need. But then after that, it becomes access to the general public in order to allow companies to still somehow profit off of it without it being restricted behind some kind of wall for 70, 80, 100 years, right?
Yeah, I think that's a decent compromise, and that's mostly what open access is fighting for right now. Because as I described earlier, the model right now is the publishing company owns the IP of that research for 70 years after the death of the youngest person in that publishing, or who was part of publishing that research. That's a long time. That's more than 3 or 4 years by a long shot. But at the same time, what you're talking about is a pharmaceutical model where it's a private company that does the research. The vast majority of research is done by public institutions with supplemental private funding. So it's how much should they own if a lot of the funding came from taxpayers? It's usually not. I say this loosely because I don't know the numbers, but it feels like it's usually not largely private funding. It's usually something that comes from a university, like Chocolate was saying. The public puts a huge risk out, and then they publish this paper, and then the pharmaceutical company takes that paper, changes one little thing, and then makes a huge profit off of it.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so for the Goblin, for the most part, that is how it works right now. In fact, it's quite skewed in the opposite direction, where as just Ringo just said, and as I was saying before, most of the publicly funded research is then privatized for business gain, private business gain, and not it's not even necessarily a bad thing insofar as you could make a good argument that businesses are the best way to make use of this knowledge and to market it and get it out and make sure something is actually done with it. I think the one of the main problems is when these businesses don't owe anything for that research. I mean, they don't contribute back at all to the community that provided it, which is it's not fair.
When they make extreme profit versus just reasonable profit, right?
Yeah, I'm going to be honest. I don't really mind if they make profit off of a citizen's investment, as long as it becomes open access fairly quickly after it's produced. But
let me ask you this: what is profit to you? Because right now these companies make so much profit that it's literally unbelievable how much money they make off of this. And then it's chocolate saying spend more money trying to hide their taxes, how much money they have to pay for taxes, than they do researching, putting back into R&D. Because putting stuff back into R&D is kind of reasonable, but they don't do that. They spend more money dodging taxes.
Yeah, so you're right. I think some of those issues, right? Like, I think the conversation of open accessing papers and research is a pretty broad topic. I think to say those massive organizations redirect funding into unnecessary ways, such as executive funding, paychecks, bonuses, frivolous spending, tax cuts, blah blah blah. Like, to say all that, it's definitely true, right? I mean, that's true with a lot of companies. I think that's a very different conversation and a whole different other can of worms. Same exact thing with tax money going towards things that people aren't seeing the benefits of. I mentioned in the chat as a joke, but realistically, stadiums are paid, like sports stadiums are paid with tax money. And the reason they are is because a bunch of economists went forward and said stadiums produce a good for the community that they're in. And eventually, years later, I don't know if they were sued, but in order to get out of a lawsuit, they had to admit with someone under oath that that's not actually true. And it's been proven that it's not true. But that doesn't mean that the taxes stop funding the stadiums, even though it's been on record that it doesn't actually do anything for the community. So I mean, that's an entirely different conversation as well, right? But yeah, so I don't know. I guess there's a lot of aspects of this that feed into it that are like in itself. There's a flaw over here. There's a flaw over there, and there's a lot of things to fix before I think it would work, right?
Yeah, I agree. It is a very broad topic, and that is. There's many more aspects, political and economic, involved there. But when it comes to the concept of knowledge and the research given, or the research produced by these universities, why do I, as a private company, have the right to take that research and privatize it? Why take the money out of it? Take the idea of continuing education, the idea that throughout history, there are examples of as soon as knowledge is made public, greater knowledge is discovered, and society as a whole advances, even for these other companies who could be profiting at the same time. It's not like we're trying to take away the profit, but we're trying to make it so you can't say that you can't patent a gene. No, we all have genes. We all own a gene. It's that concept that I think open access is fighting against, where you say you own the research that is just in general. Even the argument of who funds it is an argument. The argument of the social contract of it is an argument. But the argument of who owns the actual research, is it the person who? How do you reconcile that? I don't know if that was clear at all.
No, I definitely understood what you're trying to get at, and I mean, I have no answer to that. Right? That's a very big question. I did remember actually your your point actually reminded me of what I forgot earlier, which was another reason I really like the open access style, or at least forcing open access a couple of years directly after the research is either published internally or made useful or profited off of, is I again was talking to my friend about, what happens after you publish a paper. And effectively, he's like, well, it goes on a big server. It's like, okay, well, then what? And he goes, well, I mean, if you work internally, you have access to that server. If you need to reference that server, you have access to that server. But you don't really like copy things off that server. You don't take things off that server, right? Without a lot of permission. And the interesting thing is, there's a lot of studies in there that have some, I don't want to say cool or interesting, a lot of studies in there in pharmaceutical companies. Like, of the thousands of studies they produce or papers that they make internally, a significant number of them, believe it or not, it's probably not hard to believe, contain very underwhelming results, or results that are like, well, that's neat, don't know what to do with this. And the gut reaction of most companies is, this might have a really cool thing or really, really useful information in it, but in the current state, I have no idea what that is, or with the current technology, I can't take advantage of it. So if I hold it for like 50, 60 years, maybe by that point, I'll be able to find a use for it, which I very much disagree with that statement, because if you're able to profit off of it in about like a year or two, right? That's saying that you found something cool and you're actually progressing something and you're doing research towards it. That's awesome. If you have to say you have to hold it for 60, 70 or more years before you find value out of it, then I feel like it's good for the community to see that and either, one, try and actually get value out of it with you because maybe they have different ideas, or two, there's no intrinsic profit-making value in it in the short term and should probably just be released regardless. And actually, as it's like continuation, there's when I was working on some economic papers in college, I remember spending months on this one paper around special education, like the economics of special education. And spoiler, right? Most economic papers, especially mine, especially if you're an undergrad, result with no real actual findings, right? Like, you'll get math, right? You'll find a t value and an r value and all those fun little values and stats and stuff, but it really results in nothing substantial at all. Or your hypothesis is completely shattered and you're like, nope, didn't have enough data, whatever. And it made me think, like, what do I do with a paper? Like, someone else might have this exact same hypothesis and they don't know that I already did all of this work to know that it comes out to nothing. And which actually led me to ask one of my buddies who worked in the bio field, right? And he said, well, there's actually sites, which I think is really cool, that host and sponsor failed research, where the research is just bad, it doesn't have any findings, but you can look it up to know that there were no findings, right? Which in my opinion has not necessarily as much value as stuff that has findings, but it has some value to show that people shouldn't probably try this, right? Like, or if you want to try it, don't do it the way I did it because you won't find anything. And to know that companies are producing month in, month out, dozens upon dozens upon dozens of papers that have no actual findings or didn't find anything. I mean, even if that was just open access, that would give everyone in basic level research the no to say, yeah, that company tried it and didn't find anything, or let's look at how they did the experimentation and try to tweak it, right? I do think I don't know why there wouldn't be value into releasing. I apologize for my rant.
I think there's a difference in what we're talking about, because you keep bringing up private companies. Open access deals primarily with peer-reviewed articles, which I don't think private companies do. Peer review is generally...
Internally.
Right, they do internal reviews. Peer review is, I send it, I'm an astronomer, I give it to an astronomer at another university, and they look at it and say, yes, the scientific method is good. This is a good research article. open access is saying that sort of research should be open to the public. It's not saying get rid of the private funding sector for research. It says I think it actually says that stuff can exist, but that funding model shouldn't be allowed to go into these peer review worlds, and which is the majority of research, and then take that research and privatize it. So the big one is JSTOR. JSTOR takes these peer-reviewed articles and puts it behind a paywall. And it's not like they're making anything out of it. It's just general research from a study done at a university through a P2P process. Like, that is what is trying to be made free. That's the paywall that's getting taken down. The concept that I need to have paid a university or be going to a university to be given access to JSTOR's articles is the absurdity that the open access movie fights against, not the reasonable absurdity of private companies spending a lot of money on research and then keeping that research to themselves.
Just to clear a couple of things up. Private companies do oftentimes fund research that is publicly available. So I know this because I read academic papers all the time. I've been reading a few papers that were put out by researchers at Microsoft, for example, that are just totally out. I can get a PDF from Google Scholar. It's super easy. That's definitely not true in all cases. Sometimes these companies want to keep things to themselves, but sometimes they also want it to be out there. Another thing is, so these companies like Elsevier, they, if you try to go and get, I can get an example if you want. I would have to look for it. But if you go on Google Scholar and try to access a paper that was published, by a team of researchers at the university, it'll say, okay, you want to access this article, $30, right? Which is, absurd. When you're doing research, you can't, especially if you're just doing, preliminary data gathering, it's insane to pay, $30 per article when you might need to search through 100 articles to get the 2 or 3 that are actually going to be helpful to you. Furthermore, when the research that made when the funding that made this research possible was publicly funded, it should be publicly available. And so that I posted that link earlier about how there's a group of German research libraries which are announcing that they have a boycott of Elsevier journals specifically for that reason, because this is absolutely ridiculous. People should just be able to, if it's publicly funded, it should be publicly accessible, and it really that really shouldn't be a controversial statement, but there's a lot of companies that make a lot of money off of it.
So we've got 15 minutes left here. I'm just going to throw this out. How do you guys see the blockchain working into this open access realm? Do you see it working into this open access realm? Is there a utility with the blockchain and communities and networks like Gridcoin, Curecoin, Folding Coin? There are a couple others out there who are working on this specific problem. But do you guys think there is any way to combine the two?
So I think there's a couple interesting points. But one would be the blockchain could be used to help keep track of authors and ownership of research. So even as things were being open accessed and totally like cut and paste everywhere and torn apart, the author of specific research would be like held, and their name would still be tied to that stuff flowing down, and make sure they got credit for that stuff.
I agree with that point. I think for accreditation, which is something that we've been actually talking about a bunch here, blockchain would be great. You you publish, well, first of all, you publish an article on the blockchain, and the blockchain is publicly readable by anyone. So it almost forces open access, unless you're going to pay people to have access to your blockchain, at which point I don't even know what you would call that. But yes, it gives the accreditation. It can also, I think, work with funding and also patents. In that's accreditation is sort of like patents in that same way, with money involved with it.
I think so. I think over time, natural ways for blockchain to enable open access will sort of just spring up. But one way in which I think Gridcoin can enable open access is so you can imagine, a scientist or a group of scientists. They have an idea. They think people would. Goblin Popper, do you want to jump in with that point?
No. You can finish up. I just wanted to write it down before I forgot it.
Okay. Yeah, so I think maybe that's the point I'm trying to make. Maybe it's not. A group of scientists wants to do some research project, and they just think it's a super cool idea, but oh wow, it requires this enormous amounts of processing power. Well, why don't we make the source, the code open source, so anybody can look at it and see what's going on, and anybody can run the work units, because if they're registered on BOINC, and all of the work unit results will just be automatically posted to this website, or maybe even on a particular blockchain. I don't know. Again, there's a lot of possibilities, but I think, I've been meaning to write a couple of things up about this, but I'm swamped in work. I think that Gridcoin can really enable the democratization of scientific knowledge. Maybe democratization isn't the right word. More egalitarianism in access to knowledge, and also participating in the creation of knowledge. So even if you're a scientist, you can still do something to help make the world a better place by contributing to this project.
Yeah, and it brings a lot of people who aren't scientists want to be scientists or involved in some way. So it brings that participation in, and through that participation, they're going to learn more because they're going to be involved. And at the same time, maybe if it's a computationally intensive task, everyone who contributes to the computation gets some sort of credit to it. And if there's a patent involved with a result, perhaps a very small percentage of the income or the profit goes to the people who helped make that science possible. And you can do that. You wouldn't be able to do that without a blockchain.
Yeah, and expanding on that, with Gridcoin, if like small time researchers wanted us to do processing and such, like, could we force, not necessarily force, but could we pretty much make it a line item, contract, an obligation that whatever we process, whatever research becomes a result of what we've done, becomes open access, right? That either we get our names on the paper, or both, or it gets actually open access because as a community we agree that whatever we're helping must become public knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's a great possibility, especially since it was done in the current system with NIH. If the NIH can do it, if they can mandate that research funded by NIH gets open access, then I'm pretty sure that a blockchain network could say that research completed through this network must be A, B, or C. And there would be pros and cons to doing that, of course, but I think that's a great possibility. I think another way that the blockchain will affect open access and just scientific discovery is through funding structures. So right now we fund stuff through grants, which is funded through tax money, which is I give a chunk of money to the government, and the government breaks that up into what they think is their best representation of what I want as their constituent. With a blockchain, you can directly send your taxes to point A, B, or C. So you can directly fund a project that you believe in, instead of sending your taxes off somewhere else and having other people decide for you. So there's a lot of there's a more direct relationship between a funding of science and what science is seen as beneficial by the majority versus what is beneficial to perhaps a lobbyist. So we'll end with that. This is open access is a huge topic, so I would encourage anyone who is interested in learning more from people smarter than us to dive into it. People that we talked about here, Aaron Swartz, Dr. John Lewinsky, are great places to start. If you start researching them, you'll learn of other organizations and people who've spent much more time in this arena than us. So this will wrap up the episode. I invite you all back next week for episode 9. If you want to talk about a subject, reach out to me on the Gridcoin Discord, and we'll get you set up with whatever you want to talk about. We'll see you next week.